So the next concept is network security group. What is network security group? So network security group, it is to filter your network traffic to and from Azure virtual resources. Okay, so network security group contains security rules that will allow, deny and allow inbound and outbound rules. Okay, a standard Azure subscription can up to support 5000 NSG, and each NSG can have maximum 1000 rules. So let me tell you what is NSG. So as I told you, you have your VNet. Now you have the subnet also. For example, you deployed two subnets. Okay, for example, your VNet is 10.0.0./24 and your subnet first subnet is 10.0.0.0/25. This may be /27, something like that. Inside this, you created a VM. Okay, so please understand this very carefully. By default, when you create any VM in Azure, by default, this VM will have a connectivity to the internet. This is by default provided by Microsoft. Don't ask me why. Okay, by default, this is provided by Microsoft. If you talk about other cloud such as AWS, there is no concept of default internet. You have to create something called internet gateway. That is different story. But here that internet gateway or something, whatever, it is by default Microsoft will provide, and by default you can access from your VM. Okay, you can access Google, you can access Facebook, whatever you can do. Okay, so by default internet is provided by Microsoft. Also, for example, let's imagine if you have a one more VM over here. So by default, this VM can talk to this and this VM can talk to this. Okay, so please keep a note. This is a VNet number one, for example. So inside subnets, you can talk. There is no restriction within the VNet. You can talk with n number of VMs. There is no restriction by default. However, you have one more VNet. For example, you created another VNet which is having another address range like 10.125.0.07. So you're deploying any again subnets here. So in this subnet, you'll have one more VMs. Here as well, you have one more VMs. By default, this communication across the VNet, it is not allowed. Okay. So only within the VNet you can communicate. Across the VNet, you cannot communicate. Okay, that is not allowed. In order to communicate, you need to do something called VNet peering, and also you can do VPN gateway, etc. But that is not scope of this training. Okay, so you can check out my Udemy course for that, or you can check out any other YouTube videos, etc. that they will explain. So now we'll concentrate only on the this part within the subnet. So now, as I told you, any traffic you can initiate to internet, and anything from within the network can communicate to your network. Okay. However, let's imagine you have your work home PC here, which is connected to internet. You cannot connect default RDP to this one. This is not allowed. Inbound is not allowed. Any outbound is allowed by default. Okay, so it means you can access Facebook from this VM, but from your home PC, you cannot access your Azure VDI by default. So what it is restricting, to allow this. I told you, first thing you need to have a public IP address, right? Without public IP address, you cannot do anything which is related to internet. So you need to have an internet. Sorry, you need to have a public IP address to your VM. Without public IP address, you cannot do anything which is related to internet. So assuming your VM is having a public IP address, so now your VM is having both private IP address and also public IP address. So private IP address, it is used to communicate within your network, and public IP address, it is used to communicate outside the network. Okay, so now the question is, even though if you have a public IP address, by default, your PC from home cannot connect. Okay, so there is something called NSG. NSG is the virtual firewall that you can define on the NIC level, or also you can define it on the subnet level. For example, this is your subnet. You can attach a NSG here, and you can create a rule, inbound rule and outbound rule. For example, outbound rule. For example, I'm creating outbound rule saying that facebook.com should not be allowed. So I'll add the Facebook IP address to the deny list. So whenever I try to access Facebook, this first traffic will go to the NSG. NSG will check whether the rule is exist or not for Facebook. So if the Facebook, if the rule is saying that deny, it means I cannot be able to access Facebook. I can access all other sites, but except Facebook. So similarly, if you wanted to deny everything to the internet, you can put all traffic to internet is disabled or denied. Then you cannot able to access anything. Okay, so this is related to outbound traffic. What about inbound traffic? The traffic is coming from the internet to your device. That is also you can control. So you can add a outbound rule saying that, okay, I wanted to connect my VMs from the internet, which is from my home IP. Home IP is nothing but, for example, if you go to the browser and if you type what's my IP, so it will give you your IP address. Okay, so if you go to this, it will give your IP address, and this is the IP address. It is loading. Yeah, this is the IP address. So you can define in NSG saying that from this IP address, you can access your VM. So you're basically defining a rule saying that what are the things you need to allow and what are the things you don't need to allow. So if you look into the default table, so whenever you create any NSG, there are some default NSG rules are there. So you can see when it comes to inbound, all VNet inbound, which is allowed. It means within the VNet, you can access anything. So if you disable you cannot disable the like a default rule. Okay. However, you can create a similar rule above this, and you can give up less priority so that you can, avoid the impact of the existing default rule. So if you look this properly, by default within a virtual network, anything is allowed inbound within the load balancer. If you're deploying any Azure load balancer, that traffic is also allowed. And the last rule saying that deny all inbound from any. It means anything apart from virtual network and Azure load balancer, you deny everything. It means my internet, or if I'm connecting from my on-premise network. So anything apart from Azure VNet, it is connecting. It is saying that by default you should deny it. This is coming to the internet. So that is why by default you cannot take RDP. Okay. If you wanted to take RDP, you need to define a rule saying that from my IP address, which is this one, I need to allow the RDP. So we'll look into that. Okay. So now going to the outbound rule. As I told you, you may have a question how internet is working by default. That is working because of this rule. You can see internet any allowed. So by default, any outbound traffic is allowed within your Azure VM. And the first rule saying that any virtual network. So within your virtual network, all outbound is allowed. Okay. So apart from this, there is one more rule calling saying that deny all outbound, deny all outbound, which is deny. So you may have a question. If I'm having a deny all outbound, which is also set to deny, then how I can able to access the internet? The answer for this, you will have one more rule with the more priority. As you can see, the all deny is 65,000, but 65,001 saying that internet you should allow. So this will take a priority on top of this one. I hope you guys are clear, and this is the end of this chapter, which is network security.